And welcome to Pool the Plutonium Pork and MOX. We are so pleased that you can join Juan for this presentation, and we are excited to hear from all of our presenters. My name is Kimberly Neono, and I am the Juan Will Program Associate, and Utsi Lakiwa and I will be running the technology today. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. Please submit your questions for our presenters by typing them into the question section of your panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Either Utsi or I will ask for questions aloud to the presenters after they finish their presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar support directly at 1-800-263-6317. Now we'll turn it over to Kathy Robinson, Juan's Senior Public Policy Director. And Kathy, you're on.
Thank you, Kimberly, and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today as we talk about plutonium pork, and specifically a program that we're all going to learn more about today called MOX. We are fortunate today to have three great presenters. First, we're going to hear from Tom Clements, who's with Friends of the Earth and is the Southeast Nuclear Campaign Coordinator right there in Columbia, South Carolina. And Tom has been working on these issues for a quarter of a century and is really a great watchdog on the Savannah River site and other nuclear facilities, and knows as much as you could possibly want to know about MOX and then some. We also have joining us today Catherine Fuchs with the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, Program Director at the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, who is taking on MOX here in Washington on the Hill. And last year, Catherine was very much involved in a very successful amendment to cut some of the funding for the MOX program. And one of the most successful bipartisan amendments that we had voted on all year on nuclear weapons-related things. So I thought that she would be the perfect person to tell us what we should be doing as it relates to Congress on MOX. And finally, we're co-hosting this webinar today with Georgia Wan, who has worked for a long time to fight all kinds of nuclear stuff in their backyard, including Savannah River site and MOX. And Amanda Hill Atkinson, the Managing Director at Georgia Wan, is going to join us and talk about some of the specific impacts in the region of MOX and the things that they've been doing to push back against plutonium pork. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to get started. And one other thing I just wanted to say, we will be taking lots of questions, so just as we're going along, you can type in questions, and towards the end of all three presentations, we'll take the questions together. So with that, let me turn the reins over to Tom Clements.
Thanks very much, Kathy. This is Tom Clements, and I'm with the environmental organization Friends of the Earth in Columbia, South Carolina, and I'd like to thank Juan very much for hosting this webinar today and for all of your good work related to nuclear disarmament and peace issues in the United States and worldwide. I'm sorry, there's the slides are not advancing at the moment. I'm sorry, my slides are held up here for a moment. I'm sorry, everyone, I can't get the slides to advance. Perhaps Juan could give some advice.
Tom, try right-clicking on the computer. There you go, and then choose go. You can either click on next or choose go to slide and choose the next slide.
I'm sorry, it's.
Well, try clicking on where it says next. There you go.
Okay, sorry everyone for that technical glitch there. Okay, as you can see, the title of my presentation is Plutonium Disposition in the MOX Boondoggle, and I'm available at any time to talk about this. The good news about all this is the United States has declared about 55 metric tons of plutonium surplus, which means they'll never go back into nuclear weapons use. In conjunction with that declaration, Russia has declared about 34 metric tons of plutonium as surplus. So that's the best news that we can get out of this program. As you can see in this list here, there are pits, which is the core of the nuclear weapon, still in nuclear weapons. Pantex is a Department of Energy site in Texas where the removed pits are in storage. Rocky Flats was a site that made the plutonium pits or the triggers for nuclear weapons in Colorado. And that plutonium was shipped to the Savannah River site and the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, and I'll talk about that more. The Hanford site, Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and Argonne have all shipped plutonium to Savannah River site, as has Los Alamos. And Los Alamos is still active pit production site. This slide is a little busy here, but disposal of U.S. surplus plutonium via mixed oxide fuel, which is a combination of uranium and plutonium oxides, has a host of problems. It's far over budget, more increases are at hand. It's essentially become an inefficient job program for South Carolina, which is being protected by Senator Lindsey Graham. I believe it to be the most expensive disposal options. MOX poses problems when you put it in a reactor. It's harder to control. It could have more radiation release in case of a severe accident, and there are problems with storage of MOX because it's thermally hotter. There are currently no clients to use MOX fuel, though the Department of Energy is looking at the Tennessee Valley Authority. Production of MOX results in more handling or processing of plutonium and introduces plutonium into commerce, which has severe nuclear proliferation implications. Also, MOX is linked to the reprocessing of commercial spent fuel and plutonium breeder reactors. These are reactors that can make more plutonium, both in the United States and Russia. In my opinion, MOX is worse than the cure, which is disposing of the material via plutonium fuel. The MOX program should be terminated before billions more are wasted and alternatives vigorously pursued. The MOX program got underway in 1994 when the National Academy of Sciences did a two-part study on disposition of surplus nuclear materials, including plutonium, highly enriched uranium. That NAS study advocated the so-called dual track, which was plutonium fuel and the immobilization of plutonium in high-level waste. And also it recommended there be a so-called spent fuel standard, which was putting the plutonium into material that had a radiation barrier, and then all along the chain of handling that the stored weapon standards should be met. And both of those last points have been abandoned. In 1996, the Department of Energy started an environmental impact statement process which looked at the dual track approach. That's MOX and immobilization as nuclear waste. And those initial EISs did not identify any reactors for MOX use, although Tennessee Valley Authority is being eyed now. Immobilization was terminated when George Bush came into office, though it was quite clear that some plutonium would have to be disposed of as waste. And as you can see at the bottom here, although the schedule continues to shift, the final supplemental environmental impact statement, which is a supplement to the earlier environmental impact statement, could be issued in July 2013. And this is a copy of the summary document on the right. There is a U.S.-Russia plutonium management and disposition agreement from the year 2000, and this was amended in 2010. In this, both the U.S. and Russia agree to dispose of 34 metric tons each, which is 68 metric tons, and the agreement can be changed in writing if both parties agree. And at the U.S. request, there was a meeting on April 25th to discuss changes. And I would point out this is not a treaty. Even the National Nuclear Security Administration sometimes incorrectly says it's a treaty. It's an agreement. In talking about where the plutonium came from, this is an older map of the Department of Energy weapons complex. The plutonium was produced at Hanford in the upper left in Washington State and Savannah Riverside in South Carolina. This is what a plutonium puck, which would have been shipped to the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons facility to make a pit. And Savannah River, as you'll see in a minute, produced a large percentage of the weapons plutonium. The pit is what goes into it's the heart of a nuclear weapon, whether it be a fission weapon or a thermonuclear warhead. The pits from dismantled weapons are stored in bunkers at the DOE's Pantex site near Amarillo, Texas, and there are somewhere around 15,000 of these pits in storage, and its capacity is near 20,000, but it can likely be expanded. The Savannah River site here in South Carolina, located near Aiken, South Carolina, has been designated as a storage site for so-called non-pit plutonium, which is all the other forms that were never made into the spherical core of the nuclear weapon. At the Savannah River site, the K reactor produced plutonium and now is storing that 13 metric tons of weapons-grade plutonium. And I just want to show you some of the storage containers in that facility. These are called 3013 cans, and these are either storing plutonium oxide or bits and pieces of plutonium that were in process to make pits. That's what the storage facility looks like now. The large container is a shipping container, and the small container on the left is that 3013 can, and these things are stacked high in the old K reactor building. Savannah River site produced about 36 metric tons of plutonium, and Hanford about 67. 5 reactors at Savannah River site and 9 at Hanford. The last one here in South Carolina was shut down around 1988. The reprocessing facilities that separated the materials coming out of the reactor, Hanford had some, Savannah River site had 2. This is a picture of the H canyon that processed the rods coming out of the reactor. The byproduct waste was shipped into high-level waste tanks. This is the top of one of the tanks. These are aging, and these are the very tanks at Hanford that are now leaking that received plutonium production waste. At Savannah River site, the immediate threat is not plutonium, but Senator Graham is only putting emphasis on funding the MOX program. As you can see in this quote, the Department of Energy and the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control continue to say it's the biggest risk to the state. That's just showing the reprocessing area and tank area at Savannah River site. More pictures of the so-called tank farm, and this would be very similar to the situation at Hanford. The Defense Waste Processing Facility at the Savannah River site is what is processing the high-level waste out of those tanks. And Savannah River has filled about 3,600 canisters. There are about 7,500 total to be filled. And this is what plutonium could be mixed in if it were mobilized in the cheaper, quicker method. Hanford does not have such a facility and is facing big problems handling its waste in the tanks. This is a picture of the high-level waste canisters into which plutonium could be mixed. I'll have another slide here in a minute showing how that could be done. These are highly radioactive. These are not filled. In 1999, Duke Energy, located in primarily in North Carolina and South Carolina, agreed to test MOX fuel because the material needs to be licensed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and MOX made from weapons-grade plutonium has never been used on a commercial scale. But Duke, after testing mixed oxide fuel for a couple of fuel cycles, dropped out of the program in 2008, and nobody's replaced them. Now, the Tennessee Valley Authority's arm has been twisted to present 3 Browns Ferry reactors, which are boiling water reactors of the Fukushima exploding reactor design, and 2 reactors at Sequoia, which are in Alabama in Tennessee near Chattanooga. The Browns Ferry reactors are in northern Alabama, and that's a picture of Browns Ferry on the left. Russia has presented using a breeder reactor called the BN600 for plutonium use, and now is constructing a new BN800 reactor. This is a sodium-cooled reactor. If operated in a certain way, could produce more plutonium than it consumes, though they have agreed not to produce plutonium under the Plutonium Management and Disposition Agreement. But the fact that Russia will be getting this reactor is of great concern from a proliferation standpoint. At the Savannah River site, the plutonium disposition facilities would be the Mixed Oxide Fuel Fabrication Facility, which has come under a lot of attention lately. There had earlier been a planned pit disassembly facility which would have been standalone, but that mission is going to be done at other facilities on Savannah River site or at the Los Alamos National Lab. There's also a waste solidification building to solidify the transuranic waste, and that is way over budget, and they could also use the H Canyon reprocessing plant to purify plutonium and the H Canyon to ship plutonium to the waste isolation pilot plant. This is a photograph in January 2010 of the MOX plant. Construction started in August 2007. You can see the walls going up. This is an aerial shot, and the MOX plant is located here. These are support buildings, and this facility, kind of to the left center, is the waste treatment solidification building. Material would be pumped there and solidified, and it's unclear where that waste is going to go. This is a picture of the 7.7 billion MOX plant taken by High Flyer, who's an anonymous person here in South Carolina. As you can see, the estimate was 1.8 billion in 2004, and in 2008, 4.8 billion. And DOE let this figure of 4.8 billion stand for 5 years, and in fact, it still stands in part inside part of the Department of Energy. This is a table from the Office of Management, and the bottom line with the red, which means cost overruns and schedule delays, they are still, as of right now, listing the cost at $4.8 million. And the management of this program has been abysmal. In April 2013, when DOE presented its budget to Congress, it said that the program was going to, that DOE was going to conduct an assessment of alternative plutonium disposition strategies. We don't know a lot about what's happening with that, but evidently this is going to get underway soon and perhaps be finished by the end of the year, and we need to provide input into this. Catherine Fuchs is going to talk more about this, but the budget request to Congress was, in April, was $478 million for plutonium disposition. That included $320 million for the MOX plant construction. In that budget, the estimated cost of operating the plant was $543 million a year. It's just absolutely stunning. And this was up from $499 million just the year before. And I believe that Areva, the French company that's constructing the program, really wants to get its hands on these yearly operating costs. In the budget, as you can see in the graph, the funding, because of the assessment, drops to a little over $200 million a year. This is not enough to keep the project viable. So a key question to Hill staff and all of us is, where will Senator Graham get the money? Will it come out of DOE non-proliferation programs, weapons life extension programs, or high-level waste management? He has not said a word about this, as he's been very vocal about supporting the program. I calculate there's over $22 billion left in the life cycle of the MOX cost. The National Nuclear Security Administration has never released a life cycle cost. So this figure is the only figure out there on what the cost, the program would cost, including MOX plant construction, looking forward. Now, this is an earlier slide where I pointed out some of the problems with MOX, and I want to focus just at the bottom line here. The program should be terminated and alternatives vigorously pursued. Now, in my opinion, all the alternatives are bad, but MOX is the worst. And the ones I'm going to mention, I just want to get them out on the table, though you can find problems with all of them. First, continued safe, secure storage, disposal in the waste isolation pilot plant, which receives plutonium waste, and can and canister is called, and another form that they're pursuing called HIP in the UK, and off-specification MOX pellets. This is just a picture of where the WIP facility is and transport routes in southern New Mexico. This is a can that's been prepared with plutonium in it to take to WIP. This is the can and canister method, where plutonium would be made into ceramic, put in cans, and loaded inside one of these high-level waste canisters, and high-level waste poured around them in a hot glass. If this had been chosen as the disposal option in the late 1990s, would be very far along in disposing of the plutonium. Here's a new process that the British are pursuing called hot isostatic pressing. This is a bad picture, but the picture on the right is a can, and this is the pressed ceramic material that's been solidified. But even after it was made in, it would be made into a ceramic block. It's got to be disposed of in some form, probably in the spent fuel repository. Now, finally, another option is called off-specification MOX, or low quality. The MOX can be made into very poor quality pellets and then put into fuel rods and loaded into assemblies and then disposed of with spent fuel. And as I end this, I want to point out there's an ominous link between MOX reprocessing of spent fuel and breeder reactors. This is a new scheme from the Savannah River site called Enterprise SRS. And on this graph diagram, you can see advanced recycle and small modular reactors. They're actually looking at using small modular reactors, a fast reactor by GE perhaps, to use plutonium in it. And there's already been a secret meeting between AREVA, TVA, DOE, MOX Services to talk about using the MOX plant for fast reactor fuel. And finally, there has been increased media attention on MOX. Just today, the Center for Public Integrity, and I urge you to go to this, the website, they're having a 4-part series on MOX, and the article today entitled Nuclear Waste, How a Huge U.S. Non-Proliferation Program Became a Major Non-Proliferation Concern. Arms Control today is slated to run an article in the next couple of weeks in the July edition, and Friends of the Earth released what we call the MOX Oink ad on June 19th, and if you go to FOE.org, you can find it listed under the second news release at this time on the website. So thanks very much. I'll be glad to take comments and questions at the end or any time in the future.
Thank you, Tom. Now we're going to hear from Amanda Hill Atkinson from Georgia Wand.
Hang on one second and I'll get loaded here. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. So I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and I work with the Georgia Wand chapter. And where our areas are concerned, we look at this through another lens. We look at the decisions that are being made on federal and state levels and how they impact the residential communities that surround U.S. nuclear weapon sites nationwide. With the specific regard to MOX, let's take a look at the area around Savannah Riverside. Georgia Wand works with the communities and through the lens of environmental justice, and this is where we see the human environmental burdens that new nuclear emissions at Savannah Riverside creates. So the area, the Savannah Riverside is here, and it's located directly on the border of Georgia and South Carolina, and it straddles the Savannah River. And unfortunately, what is happening is the legacy of the Savannah Riverside has led to that the Savannah River is one of the 4th most polluted rivers in the United States. The environmental justice in the area tends to be the compounded nuclear impact of so many things that are happening out at Savannah Riverside here, that are happening at Plant Vogtle here. And when you have these contaminant releases that are kind of impacting from 2 different nuclear sources, then as you this is pretty much going downstream. And downstream is down to the Savannah and out into the ocean. There is a legacy of institutional racism within these, historically within these sites. The communities, when Savannah Riverside was built, communities surrounding this area were asked to move and to move away from the site. They were literally picked up towns and moved them 50 miles away. They did nothing on the Georgia side. Nothing was moved on the Georgia side. And most of this farmland is African American owned and rural farmland. But what I want to bring to your attention is not so much what you have is, one thing is if you're against MOX entirely, don't believe it should be funded, it's a boondoggle. But even if you were going to fund it and you were going to do the work, this is not the place to do it. Because with this particular area, when you look at the impact of the environmental burden and the burden that takes on the communities itself, up in this region, there from the toxic release inventory of the United States, this area is really known for releasing contaminants that are industrial contaminants, there are mercury contaminants, there are polymer and chemical contaminants that are already very toxic to this river. Back in the days when Savannah Riverside was built, it became a Superfund site. And when it was designated as a Superfund site, there was monitoring that was established on either side of the river to make sure that they at least knew what contaminants were going into the communities and into the river. And as of 2004, they cut the funding for Georgia environmental monitoring. So what we are doing and what we're doing locally is we're working to restore the Department of Energy and environmental monitoring in Georgia. We're working with the communities on educating the stakeholder role. And what we try to do is we try to show people what's happening in the communities. With the Savannah River site, there are known radionuclide contaminations that are found in the rain, the groundwater, the air, the crops, and animals. And recently, they're going to increase the tritium extraction and tritium production. So we're very concerned about some of increased tritium contamination in the area. As I said before, there's lack of environmental monitoring, particularly to be, they're considering that the monitoring in Georgia is redundant. And so they're not funding it on the Georgia side. So the communities in Georgia have no information and have no way of knowing what's happening on their side of the river. The targeted new missions, anytime there's a targeted new nuclear mission out at Savannah River site, and when that money is going towards new nuclear missions and not cleanup of the existing missions, it impacts the communities. The Savannah River being the fourth most polluted river in the United States, local fishing guides only account for the toxins and industrial contaminants. They don't even tell you that there are radionuclides in the river. And the river water is used for local farming, residential well water, and it flows to several communities downstream. The nuclear power plants, there are 2 existing nuclear power plants at Plant Vogtle that were up and running since 1991. They have routine emissions that also increase the contaminant levels when you combine it with the combined impacts of that area. There are now 2 new proposed nuclear reactors that are happening there. There have been increased cancer rates and health issues in the area. And unfortunately, when these new nuclear emissions come into play, the communities have to balance the fact that with such a poor and economically vulnerable community, they have to decide either a job or their health in some cases. What we do at Georgia WAND is we're working locally to restore that environmental monitoring. We're working within the communities themselves, educating on their stakeholder role and what they can do to advocate for the cleanup and not build up. And what we're organizing, what we're doing work in the community is speaking and testifying with the communities at the SRS CAB meetings, the Citizens Advisory Board. Particularly interesting on MOX is we have been trying to raise the issue with the citizens of the Savannah Riverside CAB, and they're not. And MOX apparently is controversial within the CAB itself because they're not even letting us bring it up as a topic at these meetings, which of course is outrageous. We bring residents and constituents to meet with their local, state, and federal elected officials to say no to new nuclear missions, which means new waste streams at Savannah Riverside. So that includes MOX. The plutonium work with MOX. That includes interim storage site that Savannah Riverside is being targeted for a Savannah Riverside. And as Tom said, the underlying message of reprocessing. We also advocate for stronger protections regulations to protect the most vulnerable populations and the environment. So that's our perspective from the Georgia WAND chapter, and I want to thank you for allowing us to bring what I think is a very important lens to it, and that's looking at it from an environmental justice perspective, from the human lens, and how it impacts the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. That certainly was a very important perspective. And now we're going to hear from Catherine Fuchs. Catherine?
Yes. Are we all together now? Okay. So I'm here to talk about the perspective of Hill related to the MOX program, sort of what's been happening in Congress since we've now heard what's actually happening in South Carolina. So first I thought we should introduce the characters in this little drama. Senator Lindsey Graham, we've already met. He is probably the strongest advocate of the MOX program on Capitol Hill. But the rest of the Senate, or the rest of the Senate and House delegation from South Carolina have been not as active as Mr. Graham, but fairly active, supporting MOX. And it was interesting because earlier this year there was a rumor that the president was going to kind of zero out the MOX program and leave it out of the fiscal year 2014 budget. And the supporters of the MOX program sent around a letter to other members of the House to sign on to show their support. And it was only people from the South Carolina delegation who signed up. So it kind of shows that nobody who isn't getting money coming into their district really supports this program. As far as the people who don't support the program go, Representative Jeff Fortenberry did offer an amendment to last year's appropriations bill that funded the government in 2013. And that amendment moved $17 million away from the MOX program and toward the Global Threat Reduction Initiative, which is a much more effective nonproliferation program. And as Kathy alluded to this vote earlier, it was a really kind of strikingly bipartisan effort. 328 other members of the House voted for this amendment. And you can go to the link that I've posted there. I realize it's kind of wonky to write the whole thing down. But that will give you a list of who voted which way on this amendment. So, if you want to thank them or let your Congress member know that you don't agree with their position, that's one way to find out how they stand in this area. Representative Ed Markey on the Democratic side has also been another strong advocate for cutting the MOX program. Representative Markey is very willing to be against almost anything nuclear, so his support wasn't as convincing to some Republicans as Mr. Fortenberry's was, but it's always good to have a stalwart on your side. And I imagine that if Mr. Markey wins his election tomorrow, MOX will continue to be an issue that he'll push on as an area where we can make some savings in the budget. It's also interesting to note that most of the staff that I've talked to on both the House and the Senate side, both Democratic and Republican, when they're speaking candidly, really don't care for this program. And they see it as a boondoggle, as, pork, essentially, money going to South Carolina to placate that delegation. But it's because due to political alliances, their bosses often will not be so outspoken about what a boondoggle this program is. And finally, Senator Kay Hagan, I kind of had in the middle about, is she pro-MOX or against MOX, because she used to speak out more than most other members of the Senate about the money that's being wasted in this program and its horrible mismanagement. However, last year, the French company Arriva, that's the main partner in the consortium building the MOX facility, moved their headquarters to the state of North Carolina. So she's toned down her criticism a bit since Arriva has started providing jobs in her state, which I suppose is understandable but sad from my perspective. So these are some of the folks who kind of matter the most in the MOX debate so far, but I think there are a lot of other members of Congress who maybe are just waiting for a little more political cover to speak up because this is an incredibly expensive program that's really sucking money out when we can't afford to be wasting anything. So Tom did a great job summing up every sort of history about where the MOX program came from and how the funding has fluctuated over the years. I'm just going to quickly take us through funding MOX for the last year. In last year's energy and water appropriations debate, MOX is funded as a National Nuclear Security Administration non-proliferation program, so it's funded through the energy and water bill. Representative Fortenberry's amendment passed with just amazing across-the-board support to bolster more effective non-proliferation programs and take that money out of MOX. When rumors of sequestration were really flying around, it was sort of a rumor that MOX was going to take a very heavy cut when the President put out his budget request for fiscal year 2014. However, MOX had the same standard cut that pretty much every other program had in the non-proliferation program. So moving on from there, we're actually starting to move through the budget process, and we lost our Secretary of Energy. Well, Stephen Chu, we didn't lose him, but he retired. And so President Obama nominated Ernie Moniz to become the new Secretary of Energy. Pretty much everybody in Congress agreed he was eminently qualified. However, Senator Lindsey Graham used this as an opportunity to make a fuss about MOX, and he put a hold on confirming current now Secretary Moniz until he could extract a promise of more money for MOX from the administration and from his Democratic committee members in the Senate. So that deal was sort of a backroom thing. I don't have any particular numbers on, or citable statements about what money was extracted, but eventually Secretary Moniz was confirmed as currently the Secretary of Energy. And it should be noted that it's kind of funny that we're holding up Moniz's nomination due to MOX, because Ernie Moniz was actually working in the Department of Energy on the MOX program when it was first being conceived. And so he's already very familiar with the program and its technical limitations and nonproliferation implications. Moving more, just in the last few weeks, both the House and Senate have put together their National Defense Authorization Acts for fiscal year 2014. In those bills, MOX actually fared pretty well because Senator Graham knows that MOX is in trouble and that we're coming to get that money and use it for more, more useful and more urgent issues. He managed to get the Senate National Defense Authorization Act to increase the authorized amount of money for MOX by $80 million this year, and also to require the Department of Energy to do a study of how to reduce the cost of MOX. The reason for that study is that myself and my allies in Washington are calling for the Department of Energy to really invest in a study of alternatives to MOX, that immobilization path that Tom was talking about earlier, that's much cheaper, much less exposure for risk in the environment and with people. The House side did not include more money for MOX above the President's request, but they did include that same study on reviewing the contracting and making it the same program cheaper. I'm not really sure how they think they're going to do that, but they're moving ahead with it anyway. And so the last part of this story is actually unfolding tomorrow and next week, and that's the fiscal year 2014 energy and water appropriations bills. From what I know, just the top line nonproliferation numbers, they plan on funding this program in the House and in the Senate, I believe at the requested level. However, I would not be surprised if the Senate actually put more money into MOX, because Senator Graham is on the Energy and Water Appropriations Committee. And I would also not be surprised if the House ended up, in the long run, cutting money from MOX, either with Representative Fortenberry or another fiscal conservative member of Congress offering an amendment to reduce that spending. So that's a short story about a lot of money that hopefully was not too complicated. I tried not to use any acronyms. So how can we stop this money from being wasted and pour down the toilet that is MOX? The first thing we could have done would be to fence funding in the National Defense Authorization Act to say that you could not fund MOX until they found a utility to use the fuel or until they figured out a cheaper way to make it. However, that is no longer an option because the NDAA has already been written and is funding MOX actually at an increased level. The next thing to do would be cut funding MOX through the energy and water appropriations process, which I've already talked about a bit, and we're going to have to see what happens with that over the coming week or two. The next way to take money away from the MOX program would be to have the Department of Energy request reprogramming. I think this is probably the most realistic thing to do because my opinion is that we're not going to have appropriations bills actually passed this year. We'll probably end up with yet another continuing resolution funding MOX at the 2012 level. So the only way to move that money, if we have a continuing resolution, then would be to have the Department of Energy go to the appropriators and say, look, we really don't want to spend it on this. We'd really rather spend it on something else, preferably, in my mind, a study on alternatives of MOX and starting up a program to dispose of plutonium as waste. How do we start an alternative program to study disposing of plutonium as waste? The first would be the Department of Energy's, quote, assessment of alternatives, and this was mentioned in the 2014 budget request, and it's been talked about quite a bit in the funding hearings that have been happening all spring and early summer. The next thing would be to get members of Congress to ask the Government Accountability Office to do a study on MOX and its alternatives, how much it would actually cost to dispose of plutonium as waste, and update the numbers that we have from 10 years ago. The third thing would be if the Nuclear Regulatory Commission did not license MOX for commercial use in the U.S. That would really put a speed bump in this plan. And the NRC is being somewhat tight-lipped about this as far as what kind of testing they will require and what they're looking for in the licensing process. And then finally, if there are no utilities using MOX, it's incredibly foolish to make it. So continuing to work with the Tennessee Valley Authority and other prospective utilities to convince them that this experimental plutonium fuel is not in the best interest of their customers is one other way to attack the program. So what can you do? There should be an email alert coming out shortly, probably this week, maybe early next week, from WAND and or Friends of the Earth. So if you check your email and you see something with the subject line MOX, open it and send your members of Congress an email asking them to cut the funding. The next thing you can do is to engage the media. If you're going to participate in your local media, whether that's newspapers or blogs or radio call-in shows, it's really important to mention your member of Congress and specifically say, I want Representative X to vote, against MOX and to take money from there, put it into real nonproliferation programs. If you do mention your senator or representative's name, I promise they will know that you wrote that letter or that you called into that radio show, because they have staff that are just combing through media to find any mention of their name. And coming from a local person to show that you have a real interest in this issue, that'll really make an impression. Finally, also you can work with the national media, writing op-eds or letters to the editor. The article that was in The Atlantic today about MOX was really good, and letters to the editor going in saying, yes, we want to see more of this, this is a fascinating topic and we need to cut the money. That would be very helpful, and I believe that the Center for Public Integrity and The Atlantic and a few other publications will continue to put out a few more articles about MOX in the coming weeks, so stay tuned for that. And then finally, you can meet with your members of Congress. And we have a lovely picture here of folks from Georgia WAND meeting with their Senator Johnny Isakson at the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability's DC days a few years ago. And not everybody can make it up to Washington to sit in their member's office, but you could certainly make a phone call or meet with the local district staff. Just let them know that you're concerned about this. If you're not from Georgia or South Carolina, the district staff have probably never heard of this program, and so if you can teach them something new, I'm sure they'll be impressed. That's all I've got.
Okay, thank you so much to all of our presenters for their excellent information. Now is a good time to ask questions. If you haven't done so, you may type your question in the question feature of your panel. Usty will read aloud a few questions that we've already received now.
Thank you, Kimberly. I'm Udzi Vokiwa, and just as Kimberly said earlier, she and I are running the back end of the webinar. So again, if you haven't yet submitted a question, please type it in using the question feature. And I'm going to go ahead and unmute Amanda and Tom so that they can help answer questions. Our first question is from Paul Walker. Paul asks, where do we stand on scientific analysis of toxic and radioactive waste pollution around the Savannah River site?
So the Savannah River site itself does an environmental report every year. And what they do is they do their own testing, and the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control does some other testing. Similar testing, some of it's parallel testing, some of it's a little bit more extensive. And what they do is they compare notes, and then they release a document. Each one releases a document, but my understanding is they do some comparison of notes. A few years back, Georgia was also funded through the Georgia Environmental Protection Division, the Georgia Natural Department Resources, to also do funding along those areas. That funding for Georgia has been cut, and interestingly enough, it's been cut right around the time that the Southern Company reactors went online. So our concern is that Southern Company does do some of their own environmental testing as well. We're concerned that one, the information is not getting to the community. The last data that we received was data that was sampled was 2002 for Georgia. The report was released in 2004. They showed at that time some releases of tritium that far exceeded the maximum drinking contaminant level. There have been discussions that have been happening since then with the Georgia WAND and Georgia EPD and the Department of Energy to restore that funding. We had received commitments out of the Environmental Management Department by the head, Dr. Inestre at the time. That did not get funded, and now it was agreed to be $1.2 million that would come to Georgia, and now it's nothing. So we're back to starting again to try to bring the conversation back up, but at this point, that's the I'm not quite sure what the question was, but what is known that is contaminated is like strontium-90, cesium-137. There's different, tritium is a really big problem in the area. The site has a tritium rain shadow of about 50 miles around the site. So different things are being monitored at different levels. There's not enough monitoring happening in Georgia.
Tom, do you have anything to add about that, or do we want to take the next question?
Well, I would just add that the biggest threat at Savannah Riverside, as I indicated earlier, is the high-level waste. There's still about 37 million gallons of high-level waste in 47 tanks. And these tanks are aging, some of them from the early to mid-1950s. There are leaks in some of them, and it's urgent to get that material out of those tanks as soon as possible. Some of them have leaked into the groundwater. Around 10 of them are actually, the bottom of the tanks are actually in the groundwater. So it's urgent that this material be immobilized, but Senator Graham is putting emphasis on the MOX program rather than getting that high-level waste out of the tanks. And also the Shaw Riva MOX Services applied for an operating license for the construction and operating license for the plant. They have the construction license, and interveners are protesting the operating license. But what they tried to do with the license application was have the boundary of the Savannah River site to be the place that any releases from the MOX plant would be measured rather than immediately around the facility, because it could impact the entire site. So the NRC has forced them to pull the boundary at which any radiation release would be measured back to basically the fence line around the plant. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda and Tom. Our next question is for Catherine or Tom. Can you talk more about the MOX funding and the competition for just how the funding competes with non-proliferation programs like the Global Threat Reduction Initiative?
Well, the Global Threat Reduction Initiative of the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is basically the nuclear weapons side of DOE, has been quite important in respect to such things as securing nuclear materials in Russia, to getting control of highly enriched uranium that the United States and others may have provided worldwide. And because the MOX program is part of the NNSA's proliferation budget, if there's going to be an increase in the MOX budget, and the stress on it's only going to continue, there's a real risk, as we've seen in the past, that the money could come from the overall Global Threat Reduction Initiative or from other nuclear non-proliferation programs. And that would just have a very devastating negative impact. We need to keep those non-proliferation programs at the forefront, and they should not suffer because of the growing budgetary stresses that MOX is causing. As you can see, or maybe we didn't mention, the overall funding this year is over $800 million. So this is a sizable portion of the DOE budget. It's going to continue to put a lot of pressure on the budget, and particularly these non-proliferation programs. And it would be a real negative impact from U.S. security perspective if we allow the MOX program to decimate the nuclear non-proliferation programs that have been successful.
And I'll just point out that if you are somebody who likes to spend their time looking through the federal budget and various appropriations bills, it's easy to find the line item for MOX construction, but there are also other dollars that end up going to MOX, mostly from the account called Plutonium Disposition. So, that makes sense knowing what the program is supposed to do, but kind of hidden there.
All right. Our next question is from Jessica Wilson. And Jessica asks, which factors played into the original decision to pursue MOX, and where can we find the original proposal by DOE on MOX and the hybrid approach?
Well, this is Tom. Actually, after the so-called end of the Cold War, the Office of Technology Assessment, which no longer exists, OTA, began a look at what to do with surplus materials and property in the DOE complex as the Cold War supposedly was winding down. And it was from that the National Academy of Sciences report was begun on looking at what to do with surplus plutonium and surplus highly enriched uranium. So I would encourage you to go find those documents, and they're available. And I think you can download the PDFs from the National Academy website. Now, the environmental impact statement I mentioned also discusses, and that National Academy of Sciences, by the way, they were just presenting options, but it was the Department of Energy and their environmental impact statement process that started discussing the options in detail and the decisions. It's going to be hard to get your hands on that environmental impact statement. You might be able to find it online or in some DOE repository, but that's what really discusses the options in detail. And there were a host of documents that were produced about immobilization and MOX, and I would encourage you to look in the DOE database, which is the Office of Science and Technology Information, OSTI. If you search in OSTI, the information bridge, that's where a lot of these MOX documents are posted. I know that answer is really inadequate, but there's a lot of information out there, and it's but OSTI would be one place to find some of the key documents.
And I'll just follow up by saying that you can read a lot of information in the places that Tom just mentioned. But if you're looking for sort of a quick overview of the history of how MOX has changed over the last, God, what is it, 20 years now, they did a really nice graphic layout of that in that article that came out today that I believe was published in the Atlantic and Mother Jones and a few other places. So if you just Google Atlantic and MOX, I'm sure it'll be the first hit.
And also the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability website has a section, and I would encourage you to go to that.
All right, we still have a number of questions. We want to keep moving before we run out of time. Our next question is from Gary Morgan. Gary asks, has there been any type of critical event or threat at Savannah River site?
This is Tom. I'm a little reluctant to say this, but in the aftermath of the incident at the Oak Ridge Y-12 facility when the people were arrested and were recently at trial, who penetrated all the way up to the highly enriched uranium facility, the Department of Energy required testing of all the Department of Energy sites to determine what their security was. And Savannah River site failed the test. And I have sketchy information, and the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request is being processed, but that test was aimed at a facility that handles weapons material. And from everything I've gathered, and this is not public yet, Savannah River site failed the test, and just stay tuned for more information as we get more on that. And there's a couple, at least one other organization is involved in digging for the information. So yes, there's been a failure of a test, but to my knowledge, no theft of actual material. Thank you.
All right, I know time is moving away from us. So I have a two-part question I think we're going to end with here. And the first part of the question is, what's the best information that we can provide people in the community with to make it clear that MOX is a dangerous experimental program? And also, what's the best way to counter the jobs argument with members of Congress?
Catherine, why don't you take the first part, and maybe I can work on the second as well.
Oh, I want to talk about the second part.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I would say with the jobs issue, and I suspect Tom would agree, there are still plenty of jobs to be had at the Savannah River site and across the nuclear complex. if we were to prioritize cleaning up the legacy waste that we've been putting into the ground for the last 60 years. So, if money were moved away from the MOX program, there's plenty of waste at Savannah River site and the other complex sites that we would need to pay people to clean up so that we no longer have contaminated drinking water. As far as the best information to share, the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability produced a series of fact sheets back in April that covered MOX along with other nuclear reactor and nuclear weapons topics. So that's a good source. There's also a slightly older fact sheet that we worked on with other organizations involved in the Plowshares Fund nuclear weapons budget campaign from about a year ago that has the basic information that doesn't change, such as the proliferation risks posed by MOX, the cost overrun issues, which are now more extreme than they were last year, but essentially for the same reasons.
Could I hop in here?
Of course, you can direct people to this webinar, which will be recorded and posted on the WAND website.
Georgia WAND is also preparing a citizens guide for that area. We have, it is directed to take an approach that is more around stakeholder roles and getting involved in the decisions that affect your health and well-being, and understanding what the trade-offs are. And in some situations, if you want to proceed with the jobs, that you're making the decision about that, but you're also asking for clean waterways or new plumbing lines to be city plumbing lines to be installed, or you understand the impacts and you understand the trade-offs. So a lot of it is making sure that the information is disseminated, what communities can ask for as part of being part of the decision-making process, and what you can advocate for in some of the local citizens advisory board meetings and things like that. So one is, from our perspective, is empowering or educating citizens on what their role is and how they can actually affect those decisions. And the other one is actually looking at the trade-offs. So, how many jobs are being brought in? Are those jobs going to stay? Are they only construction jobs? Once those jobs go away, is your community better or worse? So it's looking at it from a multitude of pieces that build the whole picture.
Let me just add, the Union of Concerned Scientists has good resources as well on the Mixed Oxide Fuel Program, but everyone needs to keep in mind that these capital-intensive projects like the Mixed Oxide Fuel Program or the $60 billion that the National Nuclear Security Administration wants to spend on refurbishing old warheads over the next 25 years, this is really what drives a lot of the motivation for the Department of Energy, is large, capital-intensive, expensive projects. And we have to get the Department of Energy off of the route of being addicted to yet more and more tax money and basically undermining our security. But MOX is a perfect example of wasteful spending that produces jobs but at great cost to the taxpayer.
Well, thank you so much to Tom Clements, to Catherine Fuchs, and to Amanda Hill Atkinson for sharing this very helpful information. We appreciate your time and expertise. And thank you to everyone who joined us for the webinar. Please be on the lookout for follow-up materials from us. A survey will be available after you exit the webinar, and we really appreciate any feedback you can offer. And we'll also be sending you an email with the materials presented in the webinar and a link to the recording. And just as a heads up, our next webinar will take place on July 16th at 3 p.m. And it's going to feature a presentation about the health effects of nuclear weapons from Physicians for Social Responsibility. So with that, we'll end, and thank you again to everyone.